right? Anyone who thinks Donald Trump has had an original thought at any point in his life has paid no attention either to his life or the history of the country that you live in, right? He's simply playing into a mentality that's very common, right? This idea that change is done by great individuals who seize the moment, right? That America has crises and problems and some person comes along and fixes them, which is inherently a disempowering narrative, isn't it? It's one that says, you don't have to do anything. All you have to do is put your faith in the power of a leader, allow your will to become his will to become your will. It's an inherently anti-democratic, small d, inherently authoritarian, inherently fascist mentality. And there's another theory of America and another theory of social change, and that theory lives in a building that is literally 2 blocks from the new home of Donald Trump. It resides in the Museum of African American History and Culture, which if you have not had the opportunity to visit it, you should take the time, make the effort, and go. Because in that building, 2 blocks roughly, long blocks, but still, from Donald Trump's new home, where he will spend at least a little time when he's not locked away in Trump Tower or Mar-a-Lago. In that building, one sees the alternative version of America, about crafty Canadians trying to figure out how to sneak into this country to take advantage of our superior health care. Right. We're just worried about these folks, but it's not about race. Remember, it's not about race. It's just about legal and illegal, even though 40% of the people in this country who were quote unquote undocumented didn't even cross the border. They're not undocumented at the time they cross any border. They came on legal visas, be they work visas or educational visas, overstayed those visas. A disproportionate number of those are not, in fact, from south of that border. They are overwhelmingly disproportionately from places like Canada, like Europe, not from Mexico, Central and South America, but we scapegoat some and not the others because, again, it's about rich white folks or presumptively rich white folks telling not rich white people that their problems are brown. It has nothing to do with facts. And by the way, the idea that if you build a wall, jobs are coming back, for real? Does anybody understand economics at all? Do you actually think that, like, the nation's capitalists are sitting around just waiting? They're like, holy shit, I hope they don't figure out that they could just build a wall. Do you actually think the capitalists are like, we've got them, we've been screwing them for years, we haven't been paying them right, we've been, like, not giving them benefits, but if they build that wall, we're going to have to give them all a raise. Really? Do you think that's how it works? You build a wall and then all of a sudden the jobs come back? No, the wall doesn't stop capital from moving. Neither does a tweet, by the way. Right, and often ask, what can we do? What do we do now? How do we help? There's no more excuse for not knowing the answer to that question, or at least not knowing where to look for the answer to that question, because there are folks all around this country in the last 3 years who have been engaging that question. And I want to thank those folks from Surge who are here to do that.
Right. This is a question that I've been really asking myself, because America calls itself better, and especially maybe the government, the leaders, Donald Trump, saying, we are better, that the world needs to look around to them if they need help or something like that, or things like those ones. And even to some point, you see, they've made the black people like they feeling like they are less fortunate, like they do not have potential. They can't do anything without depending on them, okay? That is what America does. Calling itself superior, calling itself big, calling itself the biggest one and the huge, that nobody can be able to put them down or something like that. But do we operate that way? Do we operate by calling ourselves huge, calling ourselves bigger? Like, do we operate by how big we are, how threatening we are, or something like that? TimWise has an answer for that. And as I was listening to this speech from TimWise, I felt like TimWise is speaking nothing but facts. He's speaking nothing but the truth, trying to show us and tell people it is not about your power. it is not about what you have. It is not about what you can be able to do to other people. It's about the level of intelligence that you have. It's about you being a human and you respecting and loving other people, respecting other people's views and perspectives and trying to adhere with it. It's about you living in accordance to how other people wants to live. It's about you doing what makes makes people happy. It's about you respecting the law and the justice. It's about you respecting humanity and loving everybody. It's not about how powerful you are and what can you be able to do to other people. That is TimWise. I was glad to listen to this speech, and I want you to also listen to it. He said that it's not about race. It's not about where you're coming from. It's about who you really are. Take a look at this video. I will do my best to make sure I read all the comments and give a response where possible, the comments that you will have given to me. Make sure you subscribe if you're watching me for the first time. And for the returning subscribers, I really, really, really do appreciate you so much. My guest today is TimWise, and I present to you TimWise. Let's listen to TimWise.
Couple of things. First of all, I'm really glad you're here. Like I said, it's a great audience, a big crowd, and there's an overflow room. They're still working on making sure it's set up and everyone in there can hear the event as well. I hope, and not just hope, I really sort of insist, if you get nothing else out of this talk, and you know, I'm gonna be here a minute, so you're gonna get more, but if you get nothing else out of it, I hope you will learn the importance of not just coming to hear me and other white folks, particularly white males, particularly white, straight, and cisgendered males, and college-educated, upper-middle-class males speak about these issues. I hope you heard some of the other events, right, that are going to be happening, and you know there are events on this campus and in the community all the time that happen where folks of color engage these issues, where women of all colors engage these issues, where LGBTQ folks engage these issues, where working class folks try to engage these issues. And I really sort of insist that the only way we're going to build a movement for real liberation is when a crowd like this will show up, not just for the white, straight, upper middle class, cisgendered male, but for all of those folks of color who do the work every single day in this community, on this campus, and all around this country, and without whose work I and other white folks who do the work wouldn't have a thing to say. So please make sure that you come to their events and that you listen to their wisdom. Because even though I've got some stuff to say and I intend to say it, and I intend to say it relatively well, you know, so hang out. It's going to be good, you know. There are a lot of other folks who say a lot of really important things, and they say them every bit as well or better, and sadly they get ignored. So here we are. Little over 8 years ago, when Barack Obama was elected president, I remember like that very week, right, going out and speaking to folks, and remember getting emails like that week, you know, I remember this one, all capital letters, red font, so you know it's going to be bad, right? All capital letters and red font. The person is angry, and they're trying to let you know that they're angry. So the guy's like, ha, 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 ha. Okay, first of all, it's like 6 a.m. Stop with the ha, 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 right? It's too early for that, right? And he says, you're going to have to get a new hustle because, you know, that's what this is when you're in America. It's always a hustle when you fight white supremacy. That's a great way to get rich and famous and powerful. Speaking up against white supremacy is a hell of a plot. That's a great conspiracy, right? You're going to have to get a new hustle, he said, because now that a black man has been elected president, how could racism possibly be a problem? Yeah, well, a little over 8 years later, I guess we're over that now. We have other problems, right? So here we are, trying to make sense of things, I suppose, and I want to suggest to you a couple of things before we really get into the substance of the remarks, right? One is that this isn't just an ideological or philosophical or political debate we're having. There are really, at this particular moment in time, two sort of visions of America and about social change that are at war with one another. And these two particular visions of America and of social change are entirely incompatible with one another. They cannot coexist. One must die in order for the other to live. Make no mistake, there can be no compromise. There can be no playing nice. One must die in order for the other to live. And the two theories of America and social change are basically this. Number one, the sort of great man theory of America and social change, right? Which is a very long-standing theory, this idea that we have problems and along comes some great individual, usually a dude, right? Who's going to solve all of our problems, right? You just elect the right person, you hire the right person, you have the right person in charge of stuff, and things get changed. And that's a very long-standing theory, right? It's actually what we learned, to be honest with you, it's what we were taught, probably going back to like 8th grade American history. Because if you think about how we learned history, it was always a collection of quote unquote great men, right? It was about great generals who fought wars and won certain battles. It was about great founding fathers who created this wonderful country, blah, blah, blah. It was about great entrepreneurs and industrialists who built the economy, right? That's how we learned it. It wasn't a collective history. It was an individual history. Into that historical framework and theory walks a man like Donald Trump, who was all about that mentality, right? Someone who comes in and says, I alone, his words, not mine, I alone can solve the problems of our country. I alone can fix the economy. I alone can defeat ISIS. I alone can handle this problem and that problem and this problem and that problem. So when he says that stuff, it's not like he came up with that, right? Anyone who thinks Donald Trump has had an original thought at any point in his life has paid no attention either to his life or the history of the country that you live in, right? He's simply playing into a mentality that's very common, right? This idea that change is done by great individuals who seize the moment, right? That America has crises and problems and some person comes along and fixes them, which is inherently a disempowering narrative, isn't it? It's one that says, you don't have to do anything. All you have to do is put your faith in the power of a leader, allow your will to become his will to become your will. It's an inherently anti-democratic, small d, inherently authoritarian, inherently fascist mentality. And there's another theory of America and another theory of social change, and that theory lives in a building that is literally 2 blocks from the new home of Donald Trump. It resides in the Museum of African American History and Culture, which if you have not had the opportunity to visit it, you should take the time, make the effort, and go. Because in that building, 2 blocks roughly, long blocks, but still, from Donald Trump's new home, where he will spend at least a little time when he's not locked away in Trump Tower or Mar-a-Lago. In that building, one sees the alternative version of America, and most certainly the alternative version of change in a social context. Because what does that building tell us? It tells us about a nation that is about pain amid promise. And promise amid pain. It tells of a country where all of the change that has come has been the result of the collective efforts of committed people waiting on no man, on no great leader to solve their problems. When you walk through that museum, you begin to see how change really happens. It does not come from the top, it comes from the bottom. It comes from the people. You walk into that museum and you begin at the bottom level. They go down 10 stories. And start at the bottom with the enslavement of African peoples and work up. It is both symbolic and more than that. It is suggestive of how history unfolds and how change happens. And by the time you get up there, several levels above, right, you begin to see how the collective change, everything that has made this country anything remotely worth defending or supporting, has been the result of the collective action of people who would not settle for the great man, who would not settle for the great leader, who would not settle for the empty promises and the rhetoric of fools. And so you come into one part, and I don't want to spoil it for you, but tickets are hard to get right now, so it might be a minute before you get in, so I'm going to tell you what I have to tell you. There's a part where you come in, there's a statue of Thomas Jefferson. And it's dark. The lighting's about like it is in this room. It's on purpose, right? Statue of Jefferson, and behind him on the wall, lit up quite a bit better than his statue, right, is an engraving on the wall of words from the Declaration of Independence, which he wrote, of course, at least most of it. And the first part of that, right, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And those words are lit up, and his statue is in the dark, and behind him is something even darker. There's like this structure, and you can't quite tell what it is when you first come in. It's like these sort of dark, looks like boxes of some sort, almost like the size of shoe boxes, and they're all painted dark, and you don't quite know what they are, and you get a little closer, and you begin to see that they're shoebox-sized bricks, basically, right? They look like bricks. They're intended to be bricks, and they all have names on them. And you get a little closer, and you look at what the names are, and if you don't figure it out within a few seconds, the docents will be happy to tell you what the names and the bricks represent if you haven't figured it out already, right? And all of those bricks, hundreds of them, represent the human beings owned by the man who wrote those words, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So you see, truth and justice doesn't come from the great man, because that man, whom we consider quite great in our American history, owned hundreds of other human beings, violated his own principles. The only reason we're here today is because black folks believed his words more than he believed his words. Know that. And then you move on and you see some other things. There's an auction block from which human beings were sold by great men, quote unquote. An auction block on which we're told Andrew Jackson once stood to give a speech. Nat Turner's Bible is there. There's an axe handle that used to belong to Lester Maddox, segregationist governor of Georgia. He used to, before he was governor, run folks out of his restaurant with an axe handle who were black. And you're reminded as you walk through this place, Emmett Till's casket is there. You're reminded of something very important for us right now, and never forget it. And what is that lesson? That lesson is that folks of color have been overcoming bigger and badder than Donald John Trump for a long time. And if you think for even 1 minute that this thing is done, if you think for even 1 minute that folks of color are going to fold when they didn't fold for Bull Connor, when they didn't fold for Jim Clark on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, when they didn't fold when Martin and Malcolm and Medgar were murdered, when they didn't fold when Fannie Lou Hamer was beaten in the jail in Ruleville, I promise you, you have not studied this country's history and you do not know black and brown people. So this thing right here, this thing right here is just beginning. This is not the end of anything. It's the start. So welcome to the resistance, and here we go. So what does this mean in real terms? See, here's the thing. This is what concerns me. Having said everything that I just said, I also importantly want to point out that this is not about Donald Trump. It's just a recent manifestation of some really old. You know, if you saw the SNL skit like the week after the election, right? Chappelle and Chris Rock on the show, right? These white folks up in their crib in Brooklyn were all freaking out. They're like, how could this happen? My God, how are people this racist? And see, the two black folks were like, really? Y'all are shocked by this? Like, This was like, we just call this Monday, this is, people of color weren't really shocked. That's not to say that people of color aren't upset now. There's a difference between being surprised that it happened and shocked. Maybe folks didn't think it was going to happen, but that doesn't mean that you were like, oh my God, how is this possible? Right? Things happen, right? And so we got to understand that even though some of this stuff is new in the sense of maybe the level of extremity or the level of danger that we're looking at right now because of some historic circumstances, some of this stuff is really old. Like the struggle right now isn't really that different than the struggle 6 months ago. It's not really that different than the struggle a year ago or 3 years ago or 5 years ago. The struggle for police accountability, it's not any different. It may be harder, right, with an administration that is not going to investigate police unaccountability the same way. That's not going to attempt to hold police accountable for the things that they do nearly as much even as the last one. The last one didn't do enough either. But these folks probably not going to do it. So that's a problem, but the struggle is the same. You understand? Even if the ability to find allies in high places is less, that doesn't change the struggle itself. We still make the same arguments. We still mobilize in the same way. And so if unarmed black folks are 3 times more likely than unarmed white folks to be shot, and that is a fact nationwide, then the struggle is the struggle, whether Donald Trump is president or not, right? If racial profiling is such that people of color are 3 to 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, even though white folks are twice as likely to have drugs on us on the occasion when we're searched, and that's a fact, the struggle is the same, whether Donald Trump is the president or not. So some of this isn't really new, and I want us to understand that because I don't want us to get knocked off stride by the idea that the struggles are now the result of this administration. This stuff has been going on for a very long time. Most importantly, and here's the really key thing, right? The very election of this man, based on the rhetoric and the narrative that he spun, is America 101. Because if I had to explain to you in one phrase the history of this country, with regard to race and with regard to class, this would be the phrase. The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their problems are caused by brown and black people. That is the whole history of America. All the rest, as they say, is commentary, right? It's all footnote from there. Right? The whole history of America is rich white men, or at least men who say they're rich. Now, we don't really know, do we? We don't really know. He inherited, not even inherited, took over a $237 million real estate empire from his daddy, but likes you to believe he is a self-made man. All right. Give me $237 million worth of assets, and I will probably become rich too. Doesn't take a lot of skill, would take a hell of a lot of skill to lose all that dough. So I'm not sure we need to applaud the man for that, but whatever. He says he's rich, and for the sake of my argument, I'm just going to give it to him because it helps my history lesson. So we'll stick with it. Rich white men telling not rich white people that the problems are brown people. That goes back 400 years. All right? Go back to the 1600s. What do we see in the colonies of what would become the United States? We see rich white people who are not even called, first of all, they're not called white yet, because we hadn't created that yet, right? We hadn't thought of that. See, that was some other stuff. We came up with that. We hadn't thought of that yet. There were some rich European people who owned all the land, and among them were what? African enslaved folks and European peasants, many of them indentured servants, right? Just one level above enslavement themselves. And they outnumbered the rich dramatically. In some places, 5 to 1, 10 to 1, other places 2 to 1, but always outnumbered the rich. The rich were always a very small percentage. Just like right now, the top 1/10 of 1% of Americans owns the same amount of stuff as the bottom 90%. Wealth inequality is not really new. It's been the legacy of America. It might be more extreme right now than it's been in the contemporary period, but at the outset of the colonies, that was normative. So you had this handful of rich folks from Europe facing poor Europeans and African enslaved folks and indigenous peoples whose land they were seeking to conquer. And they began to realize something. They were like, holy hell, like this is not going to work forever. Like at some point, these folks are going to figure out that this is sort of for them. Like they're going to want to take our stuff, right? Because they're going to realize we're hurting all of them, not just enslaved African folk and indigenous folk, but even these poor European folks. So what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? We got to come up with something, man. We got to have some kind of a game that we can run on them. What's the game? We got a game. We came up with a game. The game was called The White Race. Right? This game was called, let's create this new fictional thing. We're going to call all these European people white people. Now, you know that's like not real, right? You think that Europeans thought of themselves as one big happy family? This is what's so funny about these white nationalists that are coming out of the woodwork in the wake of the Trump campaign. They act like whiteness has some historical pedigree. The hell, you think Europeans loved each other? Man, we spent most of our time trying to kill each other. The English hated the Irish hated the English. Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. Germans hated everybody. And the world felt the same way about them. Europeans spent most of our time trying to kill each other, or in the colonies of what became the United States, trying to figure out who the witch was. That's the history of Europeans. You're a witch. Well, you're a warlock. Well, we're gonna burn you at the stake for not worshiping our Lord the right way. That's sort of what we did, right? So the idea that we were one big team called white people is absurd. Whiteness became a concept created for one reason only, and that was to succor poor, working class, immiserated, peasant Europeans into believing that they actually were on the same team as rich people. So if you tell them, oh, well, you know, you're white now. Oh, yeah, I know. Wow. We've been kicking your ass forever, but now we're going to put you on the slave patrol. Oh, yeah. We're going to give you a horse and a badge and a gun and let you keep those black people in line for us, right? And these working class white folks on the slave patrol, the ancient precursor, if you will, to modern policing, right? Working class folks, see, because the police ain't rich and neither were the folks on the slave patrol. It was who rich people hired to protect their from everybody else. So you get these poor white folks, put them on a horse to control enslaved people to do what? To ask for their papers when you see them out. Let me see your papers. Let me see your identification. Who do you belong to? Ultimate stop and frisk, 16 and 1700 style. Racial profiling, 16 and 1700 style, right? Prove that you belong in this community. Show me that you're legitimately in this community. Prop 187, 1600 and 1700 style. Anti-immigration, 1600 and 1700 style. And it was poor and working class white folks that got pulled into that because what it made them feel like they're part of the team. Oh, I'm on the team now. I'm white now. For real, because these other white folks, they don't love you. They would starve you. They did back in the old country, but now they gave you a taste of power. They gave you what W.E.B. Du Bois called what? The psychological wage of whiteness. Right? And that won't pay your bills. But it'll make you feel better. It puffs you up, right? It's like, I may not have much, but at least I'm not black. I may not have much, but at least I'm not indigenous. I may not have much, but at least I'm not Mexican when we jack half of their country in a war of aggression that we started. I know that's not. I know that's not what they taught you in 8th grade, but that's how that actually went down. You may not have much, but at least you're not Chinese brought to work on the railroads and build them from dusk to dawn and dawn to dusk to build the transcontinental economy of this country. So you may not have much, but at least you're better than them, see? And so you create that mentality. You divide and conquer working class coalitions. You give European people just a little bit of taste of power and say, those are your enemy. And then that works for generations. And then we come up to the Civil War era, right? And it's still working, right? My folks from the South, I'm from the South, lived in the South all my life. And the only difference between those of us from the South and the rest of y'all is we know that our stinks, see? For real, like, Those of us in the South who are white, we know we have an issue. White folks in California, not always clear on that, so y'all need to get clear. So the Confederacy decides what? These elite, rich, white landowners in the South decide they got to break away from the Union. And they made clear why they did it now. 150 years later, we lie about it. My people lie about it. We act like it wasn't about slavery. Oh my goodness, no. Wasn't about that. It was about states' rights. Well, what right do you think they were fighting for, Buttercup? Do you think they were fighting for the right to determine the proper recipe for a mint julep? The proper way to smoke a pork butt? No, they were fighting for one right only, the right to own other human beings and to extend ownership into those newly conquered territories to the west as a result of that illegal war with Mexico, etc. So, had nothing to do with states' rights in the abstract. The Confederate leaders said so at the time. They said, Alexander Stephens, vice president of the Confederacy, the cornerstone of this new government is the idea, the great truth that the Negro is not the equal of the white man. That's what he said. He didn't talk about trade policy. He didn't talk about tariffs. He didn't try to lard it up with a bunch of bullshit. He just said straight up it was white supremacy because they weren't ashamed at the time. Now we've reinvented history, act like that's not it. But at the time they were clear. Now here's the trick though. Here's the trick. This is where it gets crazy, because when you got a bunch of rich folks that are saying we need to go to war to protect our property interest in human beings, but now we're not going to fight. Because rich people don't go to war. Rich people not going to fight, whether it's in 1861 or in 1969. Rich folks don't go to war. Rich folks get doctors to write bullshit notes saying they have heel spurs so they don't have to go to war. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, Google that when we're done. Rich people don't ever fight to protect their stuff. Rich people don't believe in fighting. They believe in getting poor people to fight for them. Every time, every year, every generation, it's poor folks that get sent off to fight and die for rich folks' stuff. And so the rich in the South sent poor people, but how do you do that? How do you convince poor white people to go fight to protect your property interests in slaves? That's a tough trick, right? Because why would you do that, right? Like, why would you go fight for a rich person's property? Like, I'm not rich, but I got a nice house. And for those of you who were students, just because like you're students, I probably got more than you. So even though I'm not rich, right, I'm just saying, like, probably, because I've been a little older, I've been around a minute. So if I were to call y'all up on the phone next week because there was like an enemy army invading my block or something, and I was like, hey, y'all, look, there's an army. They're coming. Yeah, they got tanks and they're about to take my stuff, but I don't feel like fighting because I just want to sit out on the back porch and have a drink. Why don't y'all come and protect my stuff for me? You'd be like, yeah, I like the speech and all, Tim, but no. Like, that would be it. Like, you wouldn't do it. But these poor Southerners and working class Southerners without a pot to piss in the South, they went and fought, and hundreds of thousands of them died to protect the property of the rich. Why? Because the rich said, hey, if these folks get free, they're going to take your job. No, fool. They already have your job. You get that, right? Because if you're white and you got to charge $1 a day to work on that farm, but the owner can get the black guy or the black woman to do it for free because they own them, guess who gets the gig? The free labor, right? Because people like free, right? Given a choice between free, don't cost me anything, and $1 a day, guess what? The white guy didn't get the job. So in effect, white poor folks would have been better off to help overthrow the system of enslavement and white supremacy and work for a better economic deal. But rich white people held out that psychological wage of whiteness that said you may not have much, but at least you're above them. And then folks settle for that. Fast forward to the labor union movement. Same thing was happening. You had rich corporate owners that actually collaborated with some union leaders in many cases to keep unions segregated. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Why would a labor leader fall for that? Right? Because you got to think about it, but they did, because they would say, oh, well, we can't have black people and Mexicans and Chinese labor in our unions, it'll reduce the professionalism of the working class. No, fool. It'll double the size of your union, right? Which is sort of a good thing. Like when you go out on strike, it'd be good if you had more people, not fewer. Just like a math problem, you know. And also because if you don't bring people of color into your union, what's the boss going to do? The very boss that encouraged you to fight amongst yourselves, that boss is going to hire the very same black and brown folks that you didn't want in your union to replace your happy white ass. And then you're going to get mad at who? The boss? No, you're going to get mad at the black and brown labor who, quote unquote, took your job. See, some shit doesn't change. Rich white folks telling not rich white people that their jobs got taken by people of color. Fast forward to the present, we got somebody swearing that if we can just build that wall, but just that one wall on the southern border, because we don't trip about this one. We just trip about this one, not that one. We're not worried. I guess we're not worried about crafty Canadians trying to figure out how to sneak into this country to take advantage of our superior health care. Right. We're just worried about these folks, but it's not about race. Remember, it's not about race. It's just about legal and illegal, even though 40% of the people in this country who were quote unquote undocumented didn't even cross the border. They're not undocumented at the time they cross any border. They came on legal visas, be they work visas or educational visas, overstayed those visas. A disproportionate number of those are not, in fact, from south of that border. They are overwhelmingly disproportionately from places like Canada, like Europe, not from Mexico, Central and South America, but we scapegoat some and not the others because, again, it's about rich white folks or presumptively rich white folks telling not rich white people that their problems are brown. It has nothing to do with facts. And by the way, the idea that if you build a wall, jobs are coming back for real. Does anybody understand economics at all? Do you actually think that like the nation's capitalists are sitting around just waiting? They're like, holy shit, I hope they don't figure out that they could just build a wall. Do you actually think the capitalists are like, we've got them, we've been screwing them for years, we haven't been paying them right, we've been, like not giving them benefits, but if they build that wall, we're going to have to give them all a raise. Really? Do you think that's how it works? You build a wall and then all of a sudden the jobs come back? No, the wall doesn't stop capital from moving. Neither does a tweet, by the way. An angry tweet doesn't actually cause a company to change its plans. If you think that an angry tweet makes a multinational corporation decide, oh, holy hell, well, he's mad at me on Twitter, so I guess we'll just keep the jobs here. You know nothing about economics at all, right? A tweet's not going to change. Neither is a wall going to change capital mobilization. Capital's always going to be free to cross borders. Goods are always going to be free to cross borders in search of the highest price, capital in search of the highest return. The only thing a wall does is chain labor to its country of origin. And if you have a policy that chains labor to its country of origin but allows capital to move wherever the hell it wants, so I can still move my company south of the border, I can still move to Sri Lanka to take advantage of less labor protection, environmental protection, etc. All you've done is tilt the game against labor permanently, and not just labor south of the border, but labor north of the border as well. Labor in this country would be far better off to have more folks here who were fighting for justice, who were fighting for better wages, who were fighting for better benefits, not something like a wall or a deportation policy that would limit the ability of those folks to mobilize for radical change. That is not a pro-worker policy, but it is very much in keeping with the mentality that says to those non-rich white folks, your problems are those people. And as long as we can keep folks thinking that, we're not dealing with the real problems. As long as we can keep people focused on that. See, that's the divide and conquer mentality that has existed for generations. There is nothing new about it. And we've been falling for it for hundreds of years to our own detriment. So we have to be prepared to actually deal with that. What does that mean? What does it mean to not know that history? See, it's not just a history lesson, right? It also helps to explain what's going on right now. History, sometimes we don't get why it's relevant. We sit in classes learning history and we think like, why do I need to know this stuff? And I understand because a lot of times it's taught in a very sterile kind of way and sort of boring way. And it's like, why do I need to know this, right? Why is this important? Why can't we just ignore this? Well, a lot of reasons why you can't. Just as one little point, because, white folks, we love to do this, right? White folks, particularly around race, we like to say things like, why can't black people just get over it? Like, slavery was a long time ago. All right? Why can't they just move on? Well, this is sort of precious coming from people who set off fireworks every July 4th. Because that's some old too, right? Like Independence Day, that didn't happen last week, right? We didn't break away from the British last Thursday. That's some old shit. But we're still celebrating that. So when it's stuff that makes us feel good, we love it. When it's stuff that makes us feel better than others, superior, like we're the greatest people in the greatest country ever struck off from the forehead of God Almighty, oh, we'll remember that forever. We just don't like the stuff that brings us up a little short, makes us look a little less than superior, maybe not quite as good as we'd like to believe. If you don't understand why the past affects the present, particularly around issues like enslavement, putting aside the inheritance of wealth and the lack thereof, part of which is certainly an explanation for why currently the median white wealth is 15 times the median African-American wealth and 11 to 12 times the median Latino wealth. Certainly that has something to do with history, who had access to resources and who didn't. But putting aside that, let's just understand something. The only reason Donald Trump is president right now is because of a little thing called the Electoral College, which was put in place by folks. See, we got this revisionist history that we've been spinning for the last couple of months about the Electoral College. Oh, it was put in there to prevent tyranny. For real, you think? Do you really think that? Because I don't think that. Right? That might have been one of the things that folks were concerned about, but it was also put in because folks like the folks in Virginia, in the bigger slaveholding states, right, didn't want direct democracy or anything even remotely like it because it would have hurt them because so much of their population was not enfranchised, right? So much of their population in some areas, 40% or over half of the people in some of those slaveholding states were what? Disenfranchised, counted as 3/5 of a human being, not considered people. And if you had anything remotely resembling direct democracy, those states would have been harmed by that. So in fact, the Electoral College was in part a compromise with slaveholding states, states who were dependent upon enslavement as a mechanism of economic development so as to improve their political position vis-a-vis non-slaveholding states. So if you don't understand how slavery, because this is the point, right? Even if you don't think racism was key to Donald Trump's own campaign, which, suggests to me that you might have been asleep for the last several months, even if you believe that, understand that racism in the 1700s, white supremacy embedded in the structure of the country at the founding of the country is most definitely implicated in his election because without the obeisance to the Electoral College, without that compromise, we know he would not be president right now. So that is why we have to think about the past, and that is why the past affects the present. See, inertia is not just a property of the physical universe. It is also a property of the socioeconomic and the political universe that we have to address. And it's important for us to address that as a systemic matter. See, this is the other problem. We talk about race and racism, right? That I think we got to move through if we're going to be effective. Because ever since the election, it's been very, it's easy, I suppose, for people to, and they ask me this a lot, and you've probably, sort of come up upon these kind of conversations where people are, do you think Donald Trump's a racist? Donald Trump a racist? Are all of his supporters racist? All of these are the wrong questions, right? It isn't really about whether he's a racist or whether his supporters are racist or not. I would never, first of all, assume that all of anybody's supporters are anything. Right? I mean, that would just be ignorant. I would never say like, oh, the only reason you would ever vote for Donald Trump is because you're a bigot. Look, not only are not all of Donald Trump's supporters racist, not all of Hillary Clinton's aren't racist. Let's be clear about that. And in fact, in 2008, I remember there were polls that came out like a month before the election, right? Where something like 28% of white Democrats who said, and I assume they were telling the truth, that they were going to vote for Barack Obama in a month or 6 weeks or whatever it was. 28% of white Democrats 6 weeks out from the election said, yeah, I'm going to vote for that guy. But they acknowledged to pollsters that they still believed at least one, if not several racist stereotypes of black people to be true. So what does that mean, right? It means like, yeah, I don't like a lot of them, but that one's okay. Right? That's racism 2.0, but some updated software, but it's running on the old mainframe. It's some of the same old, you just sort of repurposed it, repackaged it. But if I believe that the larger group is dysfunctional, the fact that I carve out an exception for one guy, right, or a handful of people doesn't change that it's still racist. So this isn't about like, oh, this person is awful and this person is great, and these people are awful and these people are great. We're all a mix of awful and great. It's the reality, right? We've all been conditioned to be racist and to be sexist and to be classist and all of this stuff, right? We've been hit with that stuff ever since we were kids. So none of us are completely free from that. The idea that we can divide ourselves into like the racist and the unracist is just nonsense, right? It's not about that. It's like if we ask if Donald Trump is a racist, it's sort of like asking if a drug dealer is also an addict. I don't know. And I don't care. Right? It's like with Donald Trump, it's like, I don't know if he gets high on his own supply, but I know what he's selling, right? So at some point, whether or not he's a racist, if he's actually manipulating on the basis of race, if he's using race and racial resentment and racial anxiety in order to get elected, the action is racist. It's not about somebody's core character. And this is something that the right has been manipulating for a very long time. Go back to 1981. There's a audio recording. You can Google this and listen to it yourself. 1981, Lee Atwater, who was for a long time, probably before Karl Rove, the most prominent conservative Republican consultant of the modern era. He had worked for Reagan. He worked for George H.W. Bush. He worked for all the sort of leading conservative Republican candidates through the 80s and into the 90s. He has since died of cancer. But before all of that, before he got sick, when he was still very much embedded in Republican conservative politics, 1981, there's an audio tape of him where he actually admits this as a strategy, right? He actually is on the tape saying, listen, back in the 1950s, you could say, and it's the N word, I'm not going to say it. He says it in the tape like 3 times. He says it over and over and over again. And then he says, but by the 60s, late 60s, you can't say that word anymore. It gets you in trouble. So you start using other words like states' rights and crime and welfare, right? And taxes, right? And he says, and now you're getting so abstract, it sounds like it's all just about economics, but the real purpose and the point here is that black people get hurt worse than white people. So he's admitting, this isn't me saying this about right-wing folks. It's not me saying like, that's what they're doing, right? It's not Ian Haney Lopez, the author of Dog Whistle Politics, saying this is what they're doing. It's the guy who's actually originated the theory and the practice who's saying, yeah, this is the that we do. We just make up words and make up concepts and we sucker people with these ideas to actually hurt black folks. That is what we do. Now, Lee Atwater apologized for some of that before he died. Other folks have not. They keep doing it. Right. And so when Donald Trump gets up and says, now, see, the difference, right, is that like there's a difference because Atwater was all about the dog whistle and Trump is like about the bullhorn. Right. Like the dog whistle is you use coded language, but Trump was just like, screw it. Mexicans are rapists. Right. And we're going to stop Muslims. He didn't really learn all Atwater's lessons. Like Atwater would have been like, dude, just like, could we talk a minute? Like you're not really doing this right. Like you need to pull back. But by the end of the campaign, he was learning, right? He would talk about when he would address black folks, right? Of course, he never actually addressed black folks. He would go into white suburbs around black cities and talk to white people about black people. So he went to the suburbs of Milwaukee and had an all-white audience where he talked about the inner city, which is just interesting phrase, right? Because we haven't used that phrase to describe urban space in like 25 years. So he's still stuck in a mentality of, 25 to 30 years ago. He's like, the inner city is full of carnage and it's falling apart. Everything's terrible. You can't walk out the street without getting shot. Now, at the time, remember, everybody said, oh, you know what he's trying to do? He's trying to signal to people that he really cares about the black folks. He's trying to signal to those suburban white folks who might want to vote for him, but they're sort of like, oh, I think he's racist, that he's not because he cares about the black. That wasn't what he was doing, right? What he was doing by reminding white folks about how dangerous and dysfunctional and pathological and horrible black folks in the city were was he was reinforcing their stereotypes and saying to them, I'm the one that can solve this problem. He wasn't signaling concern for those communities. He was and he was lying. He was lying because, in fact, violent crime in this country, including in black communities, is roughly half of what it was in the early 90s. That is a fact. And you can look it up and you can argue with him and he will ignore it because facts are fungible to him. And yes, there's been an uptick in the last 2 years in about half of the large metropolitan areas, but the other half, there's been no increase or even a decline in violent crime. Overall, violent crime down. Violent crime even in Chicago, a third below what it was in the early 90s. Violent crime in Los Angeles, 40% below what it was in the early 1990s, or 50% below. Crime in Washington, D.C. at a level it hasn't been seen since 1965. Black male homicide rates lower today than they were in 1950. Now that is what is factual, but we don't want to know about that because we want to paint certain communities as inherently dysfunctional, out of control, filled with carnage, because then we can turn our will over to the great man who can solve all those problems. How? Because he says we're going to do stop and frisk. We're going to turn the police loose, just like we did in New York because it worked so well. Stop and frisk, he says, worked so well in New York. Did it really? No, it didn't work. First of all, it's unconstitutional as hell. That's why it was thrown out. But more importantly, it didn't work at all. 88% of the people that were stopped were people of color, right? And only 6% of the people stopped even got a citation for jaywalking, right? 94% of the time, they hadn't done anything. 6% of the time they got a citation for something, usually a very minor offense. Half of those got thrown out in court because there wasn't enough evidence to sustain the charge. So ultimately, 97% of the people stopped, and we're talking millions of people over a 14, 15-year period, hadn't done anything. But Donald Trump says it worked fabulously. No, that fabulous is too big a word. He said it worked wonderfully. It was awesome. It was amazing. It was great. It was fantastic. It was the best. I mean, there's a thesaurus. It has other words. I'm sure there's one in the Oval Office. Right? He says, it was great. It worked wonderful. It didn't work because hardly anyone was guilty of anything. The theory was it was a good way to get drugs off the street. Well, they only found drugs in 1.2% of all searches. It's not very effective. They actually found drugs more often on the white folks they searched than the black and brown folks they searched. So in other words, the hit rates were better when you stop white people, but they kept stopping black and brown folks disproportionately. So that's some pretty crime control, right? Tells you that the war on drugs ain't about drugs, right? But actually we know that, right? Like I know that because if the war on drugs was about drugs, I don't know who'd be giving this talk to you, but sure as hell wouldn't be me. Because I don't think they let you Skype that in from prison. And I can tell you this now because the statute of limitations has expired and they can't touch me, but... Right. Oh, Jesus, don't applaud that. Like, what is that? Like, oh, white privilege, drug use, awesome. I'm going to go get high tonight. Don't applaud that. That's horrible. I mean, it's a laugh line. It's not an applause line. Jesus. Right? But it's true. Right? So 1.2% of the time they found drugs, not a very good anti-drug strategy. The other folks, like the chief of police who brought the program in, said, oh, it's a great way to get guns off the street. Really? Okay, so in the 9 years that were under review in the court case on stop and frisk, they had 4.5 million stops under review over the 9-year period. You know how many guns they found out of 4.5 million stops? They found 4,500 guns. Do the math. It's 1/10 of 1% of the people whom they stopped actually had a gun on them. I could do better at finding guns in New York by just walking down the street and randomly tagging people, right? Just like walking up being like, you got a gun? You'd be like, yeah, I got one right here. I'm sure I could find like at least 0.2 of 1%, just like flipping a coin, like just randomly pointing people out, paintball, some shit, right? That's not a plan. It's not about crime control. It was about black and brown people control, right? That's what this is. So we have an individual who, whether or not he is racist isn't the question. It's about whether or not the policies, the practices, the procedures, the systems that he would put in place would further racism That's the issue. It isn't about personal stuff, right? It's about systemic stuff. And we need to understand it that way also for the sake of the people that did vote for him, because we got to have two things that happen from here on. We got to have radical honesty, which means we got to call bullshit when it needs to be called, and we got to name things when they are in fact fascist and authoritarian and racist and, things of that nature, and sexist and all of that. We got to call it what it is. But we also have to have some radical empathy, and this is harder. Radical empathy is harder. It's way hard, right? Radical honesty is just about truth telling, and that's sort of easy, particularly if you're already sort of radical. The honesty part comes easy because you can just be like, I'm just going to bust it off and tell you what's real. But the empathy part's harder, and it's particularly hard, I think, sometimes to be empathetic or empathic to people who empower the likes of the current president and do so in a way sort of maybe perhaps unthinking about what the consequence. And we've seen that, right? Because there's people that are like, well, wait, you're going to cut off the Affordable Care Act? What? Like, don't do that. Well, he told you he was going to do that. Like, why are you surprised? Like, well, I didn't think he was serious. Well, that's like going to a pizza party and being like, now, I hope y'all aren't planning on having pizza. Because I came for the spaghetti. All right, fool. It's a pizza party, fool. What the hell you think they're going to have? He told you pizza. You're going to get pizza. If he tells you, of course, people were like, well, I just thought he was going to cut the Obamacare, not the Affordable Care Act. Just the Obama part, just the part where they make me Muslim and issue me a passport from Kenya or whatever the hell that part was. That's what I thought that, but it's hard, right? When people do stupid, like, it's hard to be empathic, but here's why we have to be, because there are a lot of folks who fell for that. And let's be clear about it. We can joke about it because it's some stupid, but at the same time now, we have to be real about the fact that there's some folks who got suckered, yes, but you can only sucker people who are in pain. If I'm confident, if I'm in a good place, you're not going to fool me, right? If those peasants back in the 1700s hadn't been struggling and suffering, they couldn't have been fooled that way. If those poor white folks in the South hadn't been struggling, they couldn't have been fooled that way. If those folks on the labor unions hadn't been struggling, they couldn't have been fooled that way, right? We don't act on our best impulses when we're in a bad place. So if you've seen all these reports the last couple of, about 6 months to a year, right, about the opioid crisis, right, the heroin crisis and over-the-counter opioid addiction crisis in white America, right, in rural areas, small towns, yes. And there's actually a correlation between the level of opioid addiction and the vote for Trump. There's actually been interesting maps that have been created that show that the areas with the greatest levels of opioid addiction were some of the biggest support for Donald Trump. I don't think that's a coincidence. And I'm not trying to be snarky and say like they're all high and that's why they did it. That's not what I mean. That's not what I mean, right? What I mean is this. What is an opioid? What is it? It's something you take to block pain, right? You take heroin and it blocks pain receptors. You take oxy and it blocks pain receptors. That's what opiates do. Donald Trump is a walking, talking, breathing opioid for millions of white folks. So he comes along and says,